My name's Ros Wade. I'm the co-chair of RCE London. That is the Regional Centre of Expertise on Education for Sustainability based in London. It's our webinar series. This is part of our webinar series, which celebrates the 10th anniversary of our regional centre, hosted by London South Bank University. And we're part of a global network recognised by the United Nations University Institute of Sustainability Science. And there are now over 175 centres across the globe, so very much a global network and a movement promoting a sustainable future for people and planet. This network and movement offers inspiration, ideas and solidarity for joint action, which is something I think we all need very much, perhaps more today than ever. The webinar series comes in the context of COP26 and the warning by the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change of a red code for humanity. We all know that we're in a climate emergency and we cannot solve the problems of today with the ideas which cause them. So in this series, we've tried to cover a range of themes, with the aim being to open up spaces for new dialogues and conversations on sustainability, and to consider how we can engage hearts and minds in new discourses. We've looked at a number of new ways of approaching sustainability, such as through art, nature, storytelling, biodiversity, education, and today's webinar is a culmination of some of those discussions, and we'll look beyond COP26 as to where we go next. All the webinars have had in common the desire to start new and positive narratives, and to show how we all, both people and all the creatures and plants in the natural world, benefit from living sustainably with our planet. We've been joined in these conversations by over 200 people so far, who all have the potential to take forward these ideas and to be part of a progressive movement for change. And you will all be part of that movement, I hope, when you've listened to this webinar, if you're not already, which I'm sure most of you are actually. At times of danger in world politics, such as we're in now, I think this is ever more crucial. The most important thing to emerge from the webinar series, I feel, is the need for us all to develop a new and positive narrative, which inspires and engages us all in a new way of looking at the world and how we live in it, and a new way of building a sustainable and just society. Thank you. And I'll now hand over to Lynn to introduce today's webinar.
Thank you, Ros, and welcome to everybody online in the UK and abroad. My name's Lynn Vickery, and I'm the coordinator and for a few more weeks of the London RCE, based, as Ros said, at London South Bank University. This is the last of our 10th anniversary webinars, and we're reflecting on the mood post-COP26 and the emerging players and processes that are likely to make a difference, we trust, to the world as it moves forward into a period of action through focused leadership at all levels within the public and private spheres of influence. The initial media impact of COP26 last November has passed, and the interest that this event will have fostered will be replaced with the realisation that climate change really is an existential event that outscales any outcomes of the COP. Sadly, more and more citizens in our global society have experienced the outworking of climate change in their daily lives, and they must sometimes think that the world leaders continually underestimate the state of the planet, and that those with political and economic power haven't faced the future honestly. We're all involved in a planet-sized action project, but how will people be organised to do their bit? Will the United Nations become the Project Earth Director? And how will our current structures of action and accountability need to change to effect remedial action, taking us forward within the political tectonic plates of liberal democracies and totalitarian governance? I'm very aware that as we meet today, it can't be more stark what living within democracies or totalitarian states can mean. And I'm sure that the outworking of this period of history will have a huge impact on the discussion that we're having tonight, for good or ill. It will mobilize, it will demoralize, it will do all sorts of things to all sorts of people. But I hope that in the course of our discussions, we can keep an encouraging, upbeat approach towards some of the things that need to be said and done. I hope that our discussion will give us the opportunity for a little reflection on COP26, but perhaps more importantly, to evaluate the platforms that are open to us to move forward real change so we can garner the energy we all need to combat climate change. To help us engage with contextualising and reading the rooms, we've engaged an authoritative panel to discuss after COP26 what next. Suffice to say, the answer to that question will not be COP27, but maybe our panellists will have something to say about that. So we're pleased to welcome to our panel this evening Bevan Jones, Anna Markova and Anna Romero, and I'll just give you a little bit of background on each to save their blushes before we enter into the discussion. Bevan Jones is a climate and sustainability expert with over 17 years experience in climate resilience, net zero strategy and climate sustainability advice. He's worked across multiple sectors for clients within the financial, construction, political and real estate sectors, delivering reports and strategies aimed at reducing carbon and increasing resilience of client businesses and operations. He's the author of Climate Risk for London, a report on behalf of the Green Party, collating climate risk research and the impact on London in terms of key social and physical infrastructure. He's a track record in climate disclosure within the FTSE and blue chip organisations, authoring Santander's TCFD report and assisting Crest Nicholson in the development of their annual integrated report. Bevan is an associate director within Turner & Townsend's Sustainability Advisory Division. Anna Markova is the Trades Union Congress co-lead on climate and industry. Anna has also worked on climate and industrial policy and economics for the Scottish Trades Union Congress, Unison, Friends of the Earth, and as a consultant with Transition Economics. The TUC is in the forefront of climate action campaigning with its work on a just transition to a new economy that includes workers and unions in action plans with government investment in future-proofing infrastructure, industries and jobs through the Just Transition Commission. Anna Romero is the head of sustainability at Wellington College, where she also coordinates and is tutor in the area of global education. Anna is originally from Mexico and she's lived abroad for more than 25 years. She holds a BA degree in international politics from the University of Guadalajara. Don't know if I've said that correctly, Anna. Mexico, in Mexico, and an MSc degree in international environmental sciences. And has worked for many years in the areas of sustainability and climate change, attending the international climate negotiations of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change since the conference of the parties, the COP14, no less, in Poznan, Poland, and has been collaborating since COP25 with the official Mexican delegation attending the COPs as a senior advisor. Her focus areas have been the Paris Committee on Capacity Building and Action for Climate Empowerment, and the lead up to COP26 itself. As mentioned earlier, we've got a chat function, and if you want to, if any of the attendees would like to put a question in the chat, please do so, and hopefully we'll have time to look at a couple of those questions later. So welcome to you all and welcome to the panelists. And if I can just open the discussion, thinking about COP26, which seems an age ago now, in all sorts of ways, can I ask the panel to cast their memories back to that time, last November, and give us an idea of what they had hoped for that conference at the time? What was their kind of feeling? Were they optimistic, realistic, and how do they remember COP26? So can I open with Anna? Oh yes. Well, who would like to start? Anna Romero, perhaps, if you could start for us, because I know you've got an intimate knowledge of COP26. So Anna, what's your memory?
Yeah, well, hello, thank you very much. And very welcome everyone for this meeting. You can hear me, right? Yes. Well, yes, being part of different movements has given me the experience to see the COPs a bit skeptical, even though the duty of work for me calls me when representing Mexico in this platform. I believe the hopes of youth, that is my immediate group of action, let's say being an educator, were very high. We were expecting that different actions towards giving a voice to the group of youth was going to be stronger, and that was going to be acknowledged in the sense of giving more room to human rights in the whole perception of the COP. One of the main targets that I believe as a young group we were expecting, for example, was the acknowledgement of intergenerational equality for the aspect of climate change. And what I mean with that is basically that we can all act together, and all of this situation is not just put in the shoulders of young people, because it's the new generation that is going to confront a new way, a new system, a new social system with what climate change is presenting. But also it was the fact that we were expecting the voices of the young people to be more active in different platforms. But in that sense, COP26 was regarded quite limiting for many actors and many faces. As negotiator, obviously, we were aligning with a whole strategy of activities and actions that we wanted to just put in the flow to negotiate in different areas. In Action for Climate Empowerment, we were really thinking of a more clarity on how this area was going to be working. It was Action for Climate Empowerment, sadly, has not been a platform for action of interest for many members of the convention. For those of you that not maybe related to what Action for Climate Empowerment means, is the term adopted by the Convention on Climate Change that denote under the Article 6 of the Convention and the Article 12 for the Paris Agreement, the empower of members of the whole society in climate action through 6 main areas: education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation. Education, as we know, and we consider as well as part of the young groups, is essential. No matter how much technology we invest, no matter how much we are told about the situation, many times the situation we are in leads to social behaviors. So therefore, we thought that it was really important to really embrace and give importance to ACE. That is the acronym for climate Action for Climate Empowerment. So the feeling in general as delegation was that it was going to be a negotiation that was going to be having a bit more hopes, more clarities in the finance systems, more clarity how this finance pot for adaptation of $356 million of dollars were going to be given out. Some advance in the topics of, for example, indigenous participation, youth rights, how the production of carbon could be decreasing. So different topics that unfortunately were not really regarded as we were expected, with the ambition that we were in need of as countries participating in this. And I tell this from the civil society side as well. So that's the perception from my side.
Thanks, Anna. Bevan, can I bring you in now? Because I'm wondering whether, obviously Anna was working towards that agenda very specifically last November. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, from industry, as it were, especially from construction, whether you went into that period thinking not very much is going to come out of this that's really going to make sense to the world that I'm in, unless there are some really strong kind of statements and targets and money and commitment behind it.
Yeah, I think if I think about the question, if I think about hopes, I think my hope was, because hope and expectation are two different things. So I think I was hoping that there would be much more cross-border binding targets or actions, even on a sub-regional or regional basis. And I was hoping that businesses would play a key role in kind of moving the dial. My expectation was that that wasn't going to necessarily happen. And my expectation was that we were going to see more pledges, not very much concrete action that sits behind those pledges. And on a positive sense, we were going to see more media coverage, in terms of expectation, which I think is great. That's what we were expecting. And then perhaps my last expectation was that businesses probably aren't going to play a really key, important role in COP26, but they were probably just going to treat it as a big expo. And my expectation is that we were going to see peak greenwash. And I think that was probably the one out of my expectations that was borne out the most, in that there were businesses using it as just an extension of their expo and exhibition programs that they have throughout the year, and as an extension of their marketing programs. And I think that's what we saw in particular from a few organizations. And I think that was damaging to businesses, really. So in terms of hopes and expectations, yes, and just on that last point on targets, Lynn, targets are nothing without a concrete action. So to see India setting targets for 2070, to me, doesn't really move the dial anywhere. And so what we want to see, if they had set a target for 2070, but had very concrete, tangible interim actions, fine, do that, because you can always move those actions forward. You can always accelerate a program. A lot of the work that we do with our clients is about accelerating their action. If you've made a 2030 pledge, you've essentially got 7 years left now to do it. Let's just get on with it and do it. Let's try and accelerate what you've set out. We didn't really see that from governments. What we saw was more pledges around deforestation, which will to me, that's linked as one of the successes and the failures, if you ask me. But what we keep failing to see, and what we see in the business that I work in, is the lack of credible action planning. We see lots of clients, we see lots of businesses, we see lots of industry bodies setting a pledge, and what we say is, brilliant, you've set the pledge, where was the maths that you did behind it? And they say, we haven't done the maths, we're going to do the pledge first and the maths second. And we kind of say, well, you've kind of done it the wrong way around. But because when you actually do the maths, a business saying 2030 means you do the maths, it actually looks more like 2035, 2038. And that's okay to do that, because you can always accelerate. But I think that was probably where, my hopes and expectations differed around COP. I was hoping for much more ambition, much more sub-regional or regional kind of cooperation and target setting, and not target setting, action, and the role of business being a positive one. Expectations differed. So yeah.
Thanks. I mean, the thing that suggests to me is, at the end of the day, does change really come from such events? Do we ask too much of them? and is it a case really that real change is going to come from stage left, as it were? Interesting point. We'll come back to that. And thanks for that. And Anna Markova, can you give us a kind of an idea of how you and say the TUC was looking forward to COP, and how you thought it had any impact, if any, on your agenda?
Sure, yeah. So I was part of the International Trade Union Movement delegation at COP26. It's an observer delegation coordinated by the International Trade Union Congress. The main sort of demands that we were going in with was firstly to up and align ambition with the Paris Pledge, you know, no more than 1.5 degrees, to get the to pressure governments to get the NDCs to where they need to be to actually meet 1.5 degrees. We've seen that we saw eventually that they actually ended up to, I think someone calculated 2.4 degrees warming, which is absolutely catastrophic. But aside from this, we also were advocating for the integration of just transition into the various kind of bits of text that were still being negotiated. So the Article 6 negotiations and various other bits and pieces. Just transition, for those of you who haven't come across this term, is a term that comes from the workers' movement, from the trade union movement, and it refers to sort of social justice being incorporated with environmental justice, but also in particular, it refers to sort of how the process, how the transformation that we're going to have to see affect people in their workplaces, and how that process can be made just, how that process can be led by worker voice. Apologies, my light is not very good. I will try and fix it before the next question. So what we saw in the end, we didn't have particularly high expectations because beforehand, in our attempts to engage with the presidency, with the UK government presidency of COP26, we were more or less stonewalled. In that context, we had these kind of regular calls with the presidency, but there was almost kind of no willingness to engage on a higher level, or to think about, okay, well, how do you integrate workers' rights as human rights into the negotiating agenda? And I think what we saw at COP26 was really, well, I've forgotten who coined this phrase, but I quite like it, government by press release. So release as many statements as you possibly can on all sorts of different topics, so that you can say that you've achieved lots of different things, but none of the statements, or very few of the statements, are actually binding in any way. And I think that's what happened, and I think that's the approach that the UK presidency took. Which, out of those statements, there was one reasonably useful one in terms of the Just Transition agenda, which is the Just Transition Declaration, got signed by the UK, US, Canada, the EU, and a number of European countries. That refers to the climate finance that these countries provide for helping the global south decarbonize. And that statement is a kind of statement of intent that says, okay, yes, we do need organized employer and worker engagement in how we plan our climate transitions. We do need to think about job quality. We do need to think about people having decent work, formalized work, well-paid work, worker voice, all of those things. So so that is a very positive signal that came out of COP26. Unfortunately, like most things that are on that kind of press releases page of COP26, it's again not binding, so it's up to us really, and I think you're really right in what you said, Lynn, about that real change is not going to necessarily come top down from that process. There are good commitments, there are good words, but it's our job to then hold our governments to account for them.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Anna. It does because beg the question, what's the point of COPs at all? And there's obviously going to be COP27 hastily kind of convened at the end. Seemed to me, as a member of the public, that it was kind of an idea that was cobbled together at the end of COP26. I'm sure that's not the case. but it came across like that, I think, to the general public, if the public were interested, that there was, it implied we're moving forward at pace. But I'm just wondering what your view, first of all, Anna, as you're still on, Anna and Mark over, have you got any kind of preparations that you feel are worth putting all your energy into, and that of your organisation, towards COP27?
I think I have, so we haven't got any kind of formal policy towards COP27 yet. I have a lot of very strong reservations about, even among all the other COPs, among all the other kind of various COP disasters that we've seen, I have very big reservations about what COP27 can deliver. I think a very big part of where we've been able to get to through the UN process is through the involvement of civil society, through the ways that social movements were able to set the agendas, for example, in Paris, through the ways that people in the street are able to influence the people in the COP conference. Now, that's quite hard to see happening in a country that jails human rights activists, trade unionists. Any kind of dissent is currently not very possible in Egypt. So I think, yeah, the idea of a democratic COP hosted by a military dictatorship, for me, is a big question mark. That said, one thing that I think we need to watch out for and think about is the fact that there's this brought forward deadline for the nationally determined contributions. So the nationally determined contributions are kind of countrywide action plans that countries submit to the COP process, and then voluntarily kind of report on their progress against them. Now there's a new, so they submitted these action plans by COP26. They got all totaled up and added up, like I said, to whatever it was, 2.4 degrees warming. Now, what this COP has done is set a deadline for next COP for countries to try and come up with enhanced ones with updated NDCs that would actually get us closer to Paris goal. So something that we can do is we can try and put pressure onto our governments to get better NDCs done, to get more ambitious plans done for next COP. And I think that's a worthwhile goal.
Thanks. Bevan, can I bring you in on this? Just as if our listeners will allow me to be a bit kind of UK centric for a second. Given the fact that COP26 was in Glasgow on home turf, and I take the point that you made about seeing by some parts of industry, seeing it as an extension of, a huge exhibition opportunity and all that. How interested do you think people in your networks will be in COP27? Because I think what I'm getting at is what I perhaps mentioned earlier, is trying to understand the real role of COP. Because I think last year it was a huge PR coup in the COVID era, as it were. And there was a lot of emphasis on, we've made it, we've put it on, and poor Glasgow had to kind of produce the sandwiches and all that kind of thing. I'm wondering how your industries, as it were, are viewing COP27, if at all.
I'm trying to think of an answer without getting myself the sack. So I think, let me go back to look at COP26. So I think the role of these COPs do focus the mind. So if you're in a business, or if you're in a government, or if you're in an NGO or any other type of organization, they focus the mind towards a point in time where there's an acceleration of action and there is a focus on people sharpening their pledges or getting stuff done. And I agree with Anna's point, and I wrote it down, government by press release. So I'm going to steal that because it's very true. What actual concrete did we see coming from all these great press releases? I'm not so sure. The UK is one of the only countries still granting drilling licenses for oil exploration amongst some of the big countries that used to issue those licenses. You know, what is it that it's actually done? You would say not very much. In terms of where we come from, so we're a professional services company. We offer consultancy to people. I've been a consultant most of my career now. It wasn't talking of light. The light's just gone out in this office. Even if you move, the lights don't come back on. So there is.
It's okay. We can see you. I think.
Sorry about that. From a professional services perspective, it wasn't, we get clients coming to us and saying, can you help us with our net zero trajectory? Can you help us with our net zero strategy? Can you help us with our climate resilience? Can you help us with this? Can you help us with that? Anything to do with sustainability. And it wasn't COP that was driving that forward. It was, I know it's 2021, 2022 when these conversations were happening, but it was still the Paris Agreement is driving things forward. COVID and the emphasis on a green recovery was definitely driving this forward. And one thing we noticed, I was working at a different consultancy at the time, was in the November of 2020, I can't even remember when the pandemic started, but the November before we went into lockdown, we were starting to see inquiries going up from us without us having to do anything, which we thought was a bit odd. And then the pandemic hit and we were in lockdown, and we thought we were forecasting losses and having to lay people off. By the end of April, we were having to forecast bringing in more staff, which was insane because we saw inquiries go up like 200%. And I think partly because people were working at home, having a bit more time to think about this. You had companies, big companies, who were saying, this is part of my day job, and now I've got time to actually do it, and we'd like you to come and do a strategy, etc. So I don't actually think it's COP that drives action from our perspective and from our clients and from the businesses we're involved in. What I think it is if we think about the UK and being UK centric, is government announcements or movements of things. So when we heard this Build Back Better thing, that seemed to hit a nerve with a lot of our clients and a lot of new clients who we'd never worked with before. That seemed to hit quite a nerve, and we heard that being reflected back to us. And again, just to reinforce that, I don't necessarily think it's the COPs themselves. It's what sometimes you get leading up to them. It's sometimes the positioning that you get. There are some great things that come out of the COP. I think the methane pledge, particularly with the US, because it's got a really bad kind of methane problem, methane problem. But the big thing for me was mandatory climate reporting from G7 countries. That pledge, which happened before the COP. So you can see, I know there's announcements that lead up to it. So if I'm being really honest, I don't think from our perspective in the industry that I work in, the COP27 is going to have a material impact on what we're seeing with businesses and clients and industry. But what happens in between will, and I think that's where we generally see the more interest generated and more questions asked of us to kind of help clients and businesses with their issues. So. Thanks,
Bevan. Interesting point. Anna Romero, I'm just wondering your perspective on, you've been involved in the kind of groundwork working towards COPs. Is it at all useful to have COP27 coming up? And is any meaningful work being done, do you think, or enabled to be done, that will make it really worthwhile, and worthwhile to who? Because some of the points that I think you made in your opening section indicated, for instance, young people not being involved, the whole kind of idea of collaboration being underplayed and so on. So I'm just wondering, what do you think, is it at all useful from your perspective?
Well, thank you for that question. Having the experience of have been involved in different COPs since quite a long time ago, and looking at the processes happening one and another time, from different angles, from civil society, from local governments, from young coalitions, and now from the side of the government side that I have been playing. It has been transformative, but at the same time, the problem of climate change is advancing so fast that our methods that we have now as institutions are quite delayed. And the UNFCCC process has become very complicated and very complex to really give away immediate answers as we are in need of. And I still see barriers that are happening one after another, as I was telling about young participation and indigenous peoples and so on. That is not new. It's something that we've been carrying for a long time. So it's not new processes. However, the significance of the COPs in general, they are relevant. Yes, it's the ground that put us in the global challenge and put the needs there for governments to work in joint efforts. Like Vivian was mentioning, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world saw that we were facing challenges, including like political instabilities in different places, shifting of geopolitics around. We are living this at this moment very critically. The temporary withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement, for example, that was really critical. Then the pandemic that delayed the whole process of the COP as such. So the only thing that the Paris Agreement then you can see brought precisely was the agreement established as a framework around the countries to achieve, for example, 2 degrees as a target, for example, for global warming through the NDCs, for example, as commitments that countries are doing to establish certain kind of methodologies that will help us in the long process. So there are different processes that, yes, they are slow, but the need of having this kind of summits is still there because it's the decision making that is happening in this road, let's say. Yes, I can tell that different COPs have been a complete disaster, and that was, for example, I think it was COP 19 in Copenhagen. That was terrible, that everybody was expecting something that it was I think it was the worst ever. And then we moved slowly in achieving little steps, but we are at the point, as I say, that where climate change is something understood by communities, by governments, by society, by everyone. So we know that we are going there to really see how to make climate adaptation, for example, and pressing on that as communities. How are we politicians making into action and taking those voices into the arena and negotiating it? So the truth is, yes, sadly, it's a slow process for the emergency we are living, but still, I consider that it's significant to have these kind of grounds, to have big entities, countries agreeing in these kind of platforms, international platforms.
Yes, thank you. What I'd like to do now is just go on with a discussion before we ask or pick out some questions from the audience, and talk a little bit about commitments of governments to the pledges they signed up to, and how civil society can keep these priorities live for the politicians. You know, how do we see this phase, if you like, from the pledges to action? How do we feel, or what needs to be in place to keep those promises high up the priority list for governments? Is it a trickle-down thing, trickle-up thing? Is it that, in fact, for instance, thinking of Bevan's will, there are certain kind of processes put into place, say on heating of buildings, that are already kind of gaining momentum, with or without the right regulation? There's a certain amount of kind of forward movement on some issues, and certainly in schools, we can see, or I think we can see, and Anna might be able to say something about this, we can see that in some cases the curricula are changing to incorporate climate change across a number of subjects. So we can see these kind of changes coming. I don't know whether they kind of come from above or come from below, but how do you feel that we can keep the pressure on, and in which areas of civic life can we keep those pressures on to maintain the commitment to those pledges? I don't know who would like to start on this, but can I ask Anna Markova? Would that be all right? Can I ask you just your view on that?
Of course, yeah. I think there's lots of different levels that action is needed, and I think if you think of it as, you know, every neighborhood, every town, every workplace, every region, and every country need a plan for how they're getting down to zero emissions. I think that sort of that framing to me is quite helpful, because it means that we don't just act, you know, sometimes we're encouraged to just think as consumers, sometimes we're just encouraged to think as citizens on the kind of national scale, oh, write to your MP and then they'll make some law. But actually we've got power in all of these sorts of different sites. To take local government, I think it's something approaching 400 different local authorities in the UK have made climate emergency declarations of different kinds. Some of them contain targets, some of them don't, some of them are stronger than others. Wherever you are, they might be Labour, they might be Conservative, they might be Lib Dem and Green and whatever, SNP. So holding them to account for those plans, talking to councillors about kind of what's the action plan for that, what's the skills plan part of this plan, what's the jobs part of this plan, what's the plan for building, what's the plan for transport. That's one area. Another area that's obviously close to my heart and to my kind of profession is in the workplace. So within wherever you work, it's worth asking the organization that you work for, okay, well, what's our plan for meeting the relevant climate targets that are relevant for us? And in some industries that's going to be much harder and require much more of a transformation than in others, let's say in steel or cement or glass production. So again, workplace level, and you know, something that we're working on is enabling people to work through their trade unions to reach those sorts of agreements with their employers, to make those sorts of plans with their employers. And I think when you've got that kind of basis, more localized basis for action, it's also easier to then maintain pressure on the national government as well. They can see how far they're lagging behind their own businesses, their own local authorities. I'm not arguing, basically, I'm not trying to say kind of one level is more important than the other. I guess I'm just arguing for a sort of pure plurality of approaches.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. Bevan, can I just bring you in here? Just thinking about the bottom line, the economy, you know, whether something gets funded or doesn't. And just looking at the markets briefly, you know, today, not that I do this very often, but I did it today, and it was obviously in free fall at one point during the day, in some cases. And we know that the whole agenda around fuel, energy, poverty at the domestic end, but also the cost of borrowing that's going to be on the agenda in the next little while. Does this make it more possible, do you think, to go and see clearly the sustainability goals in terms of the built environment? Because we now see that, you know, having pipelines full of gas and oil from hostile places, you know, isn't going to work. So is that an incentive, do you think, to the industry, the big geopolitical kind of decisions? Or is it going to, you know, it is a real read in the rooms, this, or is it just going to frighten people so much that they won't make any changes at all. So we won't move forward on the sustainability agenda out of fear.
Yeah, God, there's a lot to unpack in that question. I mean,
Yeah,
I think
that's very
geopolitical.
unfair of me, I know. I couldn't
geopolitical, especially with today, what's happening today, and in particular, if you ever want to hear anything about kind of geopolitical impacts and climate change, there's an American podcast called The Energy Gang, which has a few episodes, which is very good on these types of debates. So if you ever want to listen to anything like that, it's very good on that. And in fact, they do have an episode on kind of Russia and gas. So very kind of topical. Does it provide? Is it going to make this more possible? I think if we're framing it in that question of kind of politicians and politics and civil society, there's a few arguments I've always made. So you need to create and facilitate an environment where people can just do this stuff as standard. I think what we get with individual action, it's very hard for people to take individual action because they don't understand. So we work for companies who have people who have MBAs, they've studied all their life, or they've been working all their life, they're incredibly clever, and they don't know how to get to net zero. And we're there to help them do that. Great, brilliant for us. However, sometimes we get into these organizations and we think to ourselves, well, just even having an energy efficiency program is just common sense. Why don't you have one? So we challenge our clients quite a lot. We're quite blunt with some of our clients in that respect. But you have to facilitate and create the environment for it to happen. So a good example on an individual basis is recycling. I want to recycle, my council provides bins. So I go out the front, I put everything in a bin, they take it away. I want to recycle, my council doesn't provide bins. Well, I've got to take it a bit further down the road. There's still a thing, but I'm probably less likely to do so if I'm doing 10 other things that day, etc. It's the same for business. It's the same for large organizations. I think you create the environment to it. And the only way that you can create the environment to it is if your government is saying the right things, which is one, which I think this government has attempted to say the right things, but there is a huge trust issue with this government. We realise that it can say the right things or say the right things to get people listening, but then it tends to do something else entirely, which sends mixed messages. So again, the example of kind of oil licenses that I gave earlier. I think the economic imperative, and very much in the world that Anna's in, this thing about green jobs. Every government wants to create jobs, and in particular, we see it. I'll give you an example of our team in Turner and Townsend. I joined in April last year. I was number 22 in the door. As of this week, we are now 50 people in our team. So we have doubled in size, and we are a professional services company. We are not doing the hard stuff like building wind turbines. We're not doing the hard stuff like trying to get solar deployed across rooftops, across cities. We're not doing the hard stuff. We're a professional services company. So you can imagine the stuff that actually needs to be delivered. There's a huge opportunity there in terms of green jobs, and across every level of professionalism, whether you want to be a consultant like me, a lawyer, a green roof installer, a solar panel installer, a carbon accountant. There are opportunities across every level of traditional, professional and non-professional activities, and you can apply a green lens to it. The issue we have, if we want to keep the pressure on governments, is we have to constantly demonstrate what this is. We have to not pay attention to I'm in between. I was trying to find the name of the Tory group, which is kind of trying to argue against the government's net zero plans. But we have to kind of put those groups to one side and realise that they are short-term blips in a long-term activity where we are just trying to get people employed. We can speak to politicians in that respect. And when we're trying to make this more possible and trying to get people to think, can I do this, and empower them to do this? When it comes to politicians, we have to talk to the different type of politicians we've got. We've got career politicians. So how is this going to advance their career? We've got politicians who really want to change the world. How do we enable them to change the world in this respect? We've got politicians who are motivated by political belief. How do we make this fit with their political beliefs? Now, I know you can't have a tailored plan for each politician, but this is how we appeal to it. And it's the same in the way that we appeal to CEOs of businesses or chief financial officers or HR directors, we appeal on their grounds and we say, this is going to help with this, or this will enable your business to do this. And then lastly, in terms of what's happening geopolitically, I don't necessarily think if you're sitting at home and you're faced with a 50% increase in your electricity bill, I don't think you're necessarily thinking about these geopolitical, you're thinking, how am I going to pay that bill? It's the same, a friend of mine works for a huge cultural organisation in London, texted me last night, our energy bill is going up £100,000, and what do we do? Help. And so that's what you're most concerned about. And what I said back in that text, but also what I say to a lot of clients is, we shouldn't pretend that being on a green tariff or moving to a green infrastructure in terms of energy generation is cheap. It's not cheap. The previously, some of the highest energy bills in Europe were in Denmark, where there was huge investment in the energy infrastructure. And so that the result is you get higher bills. I think the problem we've had, and the problem we as consultants are constantly battling with our clients, is green doesn't equal cheap. Green equals investment. Green equals investment in jobs. Green equals investment in infrastructure, and investment costs money. And this is the message we're always doing. But with that investment, you get more jobs, you get a better environment. You should get a better environment. You get better businesses, and I think that is one of the things that we're all anchoring for here. So yeah, that's
yes,
fine.
Thanks, Ben. What occurs to me from what you're saying there is the need for well, this very much brings in Anna Markova's world as well, the need for credibility within the green jobs sector, that these jobs are long-term quality jobs that kind of fit the moment, but there will be mistakes en route. And certainly in the building industry, there have been plenty of mistakes en route in terms of insulation, and the classic one where people were so hot in blocks of flats that to knock the windows out kind of thing in the summer of heat. We make a lot of mistakes, but it's an interesting kind of feel that there is a momentum that probably is going to roll on, irrespective of the conditions the downturn in political interest, as it were, that there might be. A lot of people are genuinely moving forward. So Anna Romero, just thinking about credibility really within the governance structure of governments and within the COP framework. Do you think there are some, if the balance is between a good governance and bad governance within the COP kind of networks, do you think the majority of people that signed up at the end of the COP process in 26 have sway? Do they carry the day to move forward in some kind of credible way, even if there are some governments that signed up that will fall by the wayside, or certainly just did it for publicity purposes?
Yeah, well, as there is always the political strategies in each country, there may be governments that see these grounds just to show up like what they are trying to do and convince the public to gain more votes. And there are others that are really, really committed. But if we get to see and measure everyone that is part of the convention, I strongly believe that it's important that a climate change framework on laws is established in better force, let's say, and specify the accountability for the implementation of all the obligations in which countries have agreed on when signing or being part of the convention. And within those laws, there should be, for example, a follow-up on what we have said we are committing to. So obviously there's different limitations and so on, but in general, it's like a follow-up and identify on which obligations are created, who is accountable for what or whom, how is compliance assessed, what happens in the case of non-compliance, for example. The clear example of the United States recently was really clear and sent the message that all this framework was completely weak. Nothing really happened. You just stepped down, away, and the massive problem was there. It's important, obviously, to assess that compliance and as well assessing effectiveness. Is this being effective? Is this whole process of the COPs, of the UNFCCC effective? It's important to have strong institutions in this case. Precisely looking into these processes, the UNFCCC will be having a very strong assessment in 2023, where all the historical record of all the COPs will be assessed, and from there new decisions will be taken. So as I said before, the problem of climate change is going far faster than we are acting politically and taking decisions and obligations and achievements, and ambition is there, but it's not really being reflected. So it will be interesting to see what happens precisely after that evaluation of all the COPs in 2023, see the effectiveness of the institutions, and how this climate change framework in laws can really help to speed up the process.
Thanks, Anna. Just something you've stimulated in my thinking, like the ignorance on my part, is the appetite for international law. At the moment, my understanding is obviously cooperation between governments is something that they can negotiate between themselves on any climate change issues. But of course, in terms of systems thinking, there has to be a lot of kind of governments all kind of going in the same direction, as it were, to make legislation effective on the ground. Did you get any sense at all whether there was a willingness to even contemplate wider cooperations internationally, as legal cooperations almost at a treaty level, to, for example, save the Amazon? That's a bad example probably, because there's no chance of framework coming in there. But the idea of having a global legal obligations, was there any kind of talk about that?
I personally was not involved in that process, if I'm honest. It's something that we as delegation, we were observing and we have been discussing. But there is different elements that are very interesting. For example, during COP26, there were a series of pledges, like the methane one, that were presented to give the feeling that countries were committing to something. But the truth is that those pledges were not at all compulsory. It was the goodwill. And with the goodwill, we will do nothing.
Yeah.
So at the same time, it's like, I would like to recall this part of the UNFCCC, stop playing like you are really acting and that you are really doing something with certain purpose, but that we really need to implement the things that we are committing to with realities, with measurements, and not just pledges that we sign there and next year are forgotten.
I forgot. Thank you. Anna Markova, can I just a follow-on question before we actually answer questions from those listening. When within the TUC framework and the kind of international part of the trade unions work, if you're looking, say, at the steel industry or coal industry and negotiating around just transitions, is there a framework where you're operating across national boundaries, say from Germany to Britain or whatever, where the supply chain, involves a number of countries, in if you like, say the steel industry or whatever it is there a framework in which you can kind of have just transition discussions across boundaries?
Yeah, I think so. I think one really good example of international collaboration on a just transition is what's happened with offshore wind energy in New York State recently, where so let's do a comparison. So in the UK, the offshore wind industry has grown massively. The capacity has grown more than twofold in the past 5 years. The UK was until recently a leader in the amount of installed offshore wind turbines. We barely saw any jobs coming out of it. There are jobs installing and constructing wind farms, but far less than what was promised. Now, the US has done quite a different approach, coming into the industry a little bit later than the UK. But what's happened is that North American trade unions, the North American building trades unions, together with the AFL-CIO, the kind of 2C equivalent in the US, have worked together with Danish and Norwegian trade unions to unionize the industry as it is arriving via some of the biggest players in the industry. So Equinor and Ørsted are the two companies involved. And now Ørsted, who doesn't recognize any trade unions in the UK, in the US is signed a framework agreement, including with the unions, including with the governor of New York State, for the quality of those jobs, for the pay level of those jobs, for the skills and training, for the jobs in the construction of those wind turbines. And I think that's a really good example. The collaboration internationally between trade unions across kind of where these companies operate is a really good example of how a just transition can be leveraged internationally. But I don't think we've seen enough of that yet, and I think that's a big task for us to do. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what Bevan said before about green jobs, because I think it's important when we talk about those opportunities. I think it's important to acknowledge that so far in lots of sectors, those opportunities haven't really materialized to the extent that they have been promised, and offshore wind is a really good example of this. In Scotland, on the east coast of Scotland in Fife, there are fabrication yards that stood ready to make parts for wind turbines that are kind of within sight of where the yard is, and the contracts for those foundations and for those towers for the wind turbines actually went elsewhere. The companies decided, oh, it's cheaper for us to ship them in from Indonesia or whatever it is, and that's what the companies did. And that there's a whole lecture that you could do on why that happened, but the fact is, stories like that make people quite skeptical of whether green jobs will show up for them in their local area. So I think we have to think carefully about, we do want to highlight the opportunity. We do want to think about, yes, every job can become a green job. Every workplace can be a future-proof workplace, and a green economy can be an economy with more jobs, more good jobs for more people. But we have to think carefully about how that world differs from the world that we live in now. And the key parts of that are, to us, are kind of much more active government investment, much more active government use of leverage to make sure that jobs are quality jobs and to make sure that jobs are created domestically. And also much more active worker participation in the decision making on what those kind of workplace level plans. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about green jobs.
Thanks, Anna. You okay with that, Bevan, or do you want to come back on that at all?
No, I agree with everything that Anna says. I mean, the thing is that, yeah, she's totally right in kind of how do we get to that point. You do need the government signal. I've worked previously in local government, and if you want something done, the local authority, this was kind of pre-austerity, but the local authority needs to show, either put some money into something to show that it's anchored somewhere, and then that attracts the interest from other people. That's not as possible, not as easy these days, granted. But it's the how you get there, and again, I think it's totally right in pointing out the fact that and we have a lot of these conversations with particularly around the built environment and people making choices on materials and things like that. There is a change of mindset needed. I think I saw something in the comments about this. There's a change of mindset needed in how businesses operate. There's no net zero business in the UK, and there's no net zero business in the world, and it's because they genuinely have not changed their business models. They're not, you know, their manufacturing companies are still making loads of stuff instead of repairing it. Companies are still flying over the world, all over the world, when they could video conference. Some companies are offsetting opaquely rather than transparently. So there is no such thing as a net zero business. And what we need to do is to change that mindset around things like that. And then what you'll see from that is a change of mindset in terms of the jobs and the way that people think about how they need to employ people and what they need to employ. Because instead of having money as one of the bottom line, as one of the decision-making points, you have carbon as one of the decision-making points, or you have resilience as one of the decision-making points. And then the mindset changes. We are starting to see this in the building sector. Previously, especially around kind of the embodied carbon, the carbon that you emit when you're building something up to practical completion. We are starting to see this where we do these studies for people and we say, look, this is how much carbon your standard building plan would emit. This is how much carbon your lower carbon building plan is going to emit. Make some decisions, and we break it down and say, well, this item costs you this much money, but it only emits this much carbon. This is your standard item. It costs you nothing, but look how much carbon. And we leave it to them to make a decision. And what we're seeing is people making more decisions based on carbon than on cost. It's a very small percentage, I have to say. I'm optimistic about it, but it's a small percentage. We need that to happen on organizational and industry level. We need that change of mindset to happen like that, because the minute you start putting cost, Anna's example was perfect. The minute you start seeing cost and go, well, actually, it's cheaper to outsource this to some other part of the world, there's no such, then you're not a net zero business. You're not thinking in a net zero way, and that change in mindset is really important about the how you do it and how you get there. So yeah, I'm a long-winded way of saying that I agree with what Anna just said. So
thanks, Bevan. Okay, right now the last 50 minutes we're going to have a look at a couple of questions from the chat. So I'm going to ask Hugh, if Hugh's there, if he'd like to perhaps pick out a couple. Are you there, Hugh?
Yes, I am. I haven't gone off to the pub. I'm still here. Yes.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hello, hi. Yeah,
So,
there was there was a number of comments in the chat and questions. I think it flowed. I thought that was a really good format, the way you did it there, Lynn. And the three speakers, it engages the audience, and it was lovely not to have any PowerPoints. It was a great relief. Makes people think more without PowerPoints. Just there was the question you asked at the beginning: does change ever come from these big conferences? And I think the panel answered that really by saying maybe not the conferences, but the lead to and the aftermath and the impetus to provide. But there's one question that that Jenith asked. She said she'd been to a meeting where the question was asked: did the lack of cooperation on the global vaccine for COVID, did that possibly undermine cooperation at the recent COP26?
right. Does anybody want to come back on that point from Janice?
I'm going to say I don't think it did, but I think it's a symptom of what we're seeing in the world in terms of a reduction in global cooperation, whether it's isolationism from the states, whether it's isolation from any number of countries, and kind of putting themselves first. I think it's a symptom of the same thing that we are seeing. You know, the UK is a prime example of that with Brexit. You know, regardless whether you think Brexit is a good or a bad thing, it's increasing isolationism that we're seeing, or unilateralism that we're seeing. And I don't think the vaccine program necessarily influenced the outcome of COP and the cooperation or lack of it at COP, but I do think they are the symptom of the same geopolitical things we're starting to see.
Any comments from Anna, or we'll move on to the next question. Anna, knock over.
I think there's just something there about a question of principle, and imagine you're a country that doesn't have access to, you represent a country that doesn't have access to vaccines. You're relying on the global north to set a lot of the rules as part of the COP process, and you're relying on that multilateralism, and you can everywhere around you can see a failure of multilateralism, a failure of the global north to share its resources. So I think just on that level, I think it's just a very evident example of how it does undermine that effort. And I'm almost going to apologize. I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes because of a little childcare emergency. So
no problem, Anna.
If I can quickly answer any other questions that are particularly for me, that would be great.
Okay, and we don't. If you suddenly disappear, Anna, I'll say my thanks now. Drop you an email tomorrow. But another question, Hugh?
Yeah, there was another one which actually links to a comment Anna made in the chat, actually. Can green jobs become a key part of a positive narrative which will really engage the public?
Well, Anna, can you stay for that one?
Sure, yeah. So maybe I will answer that one and then I'll disappear.
Okay.
Something that I'd like to say about that is that green jobs have been a key part of Tory government rhetoric for a bit, or were at least last year. And then polling started showing that people don't really relate to the concept of green jobs. When you say green jobs to a random person on the street somewhere in Hull or something, they will likely think you're talking about sweeping the streets or planting trees. They might not think about making green steel or building wind turbines, or all of the other wonderful things that Bevan named when he made the list of possible green jobs. What people really look for, and I'm relying on some great focus group work by Green Alliance here, what people actually want is jobs that are good, jobs that are that don't overwork you, jobs that pay you well, jobs where you feel like you're meaningfully engaged, and jobs that have a future where you're not going to have to sort of apply for a new job every half a year. That's what people really want, and that's why we're talking now more about future-proofing jobs than about new green jobs, because that's that is what really resonates with people, and that's and I don't think anyone's completely solved this puzzle yet, but I think we need to be able to tell a story about good jobs for everybody who wants them, and green jobs don't quite do that yet. And on that note, I'm going to go and look after a very grumpy toddler. So thank you, everybody.
Very much, Anna. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Hugh, have we got any questions at all about education or politics, or organisation?
I asked a question.
Oh, right, okay.
So can I ask my question? I don't know if it's too big a question, or it's.
Go on.
Back in the 1950s, Eisenhower, when he was US president, talked about the power of the military-industrial complex and its threat to democracy and society. Does such a complex present a similar threat in the COP process? Because as I understand it, the whole question of war and military hardware, which makes a huge contribution to greenhouse gases, doesn't really figure in the COP process.
Okay, Anna, can you, Romero, can you give any insight into, were the guns ever mentioned at the last COP? They seem to be very absent in the press releases.
Well, the truth is that lots of governments are taking away budgets from other essential sectors such as health and education to put it into the military. And it is not something really new. As you say, it's happening since quite a long time ago. But the reality is that when we are thinking about the investments that countries they need to do about this topic, is not about only the national budgets, is where the money comes from to really help to put this whole process to go. is not only about one only sector that is there. Is really the whole compounds of how to see the finances working in this system. Basically, that's my addition to this.
Yes, thank you. Any comment, Bevan, you want to make on that one?
Yeah, it's not entirely my area, but I mean, I think we're also, I mean, we're in this, I kind of mentioned it up top around this kind of greenwashing, green marketing. You will even find, but my team recently turned down a project that was related to nuclear because we didn't feel that it had any role to play in the transition of the UK to net zero. And that was a series of studies we were going to do on the building of these facilities. But we turned it down because we don't feel that that should be supporting it now. But what you've got is a company there that works, and this guy, I won't name the company, but who works in that, who supports the military industry in the UK. And I had a few members of the team who were very uncomfortable with doing anything like that. So we turned it down, and it wasn't a hard decision to make. But this same company makes pledges about how it's going to be net zero by 2030. So I think we live in a world which is part reality, part marketing, and I think we need to be very aware and even more attuned now that the military-industrial complex is probably what's the word? Probably, and this might sound a bit contradictory, is probably more subtle than it used to be, and has different ways of kind of finding itself in positions where it can exert its influence on things like climate negotiations or net zero targets because of its power in terms of lobbying and being able to get access to the politicians we were talking about earlier.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting point. Hugh, we've got time for just perhaps one more, perhaps two more.
There's a question just come in from Chit Chong. He says, he or she, picking up on Bevan's point about net zero watch being a blip, surely it has been decades of blips, and that we now need to prosecute the people responsible for the blips which stop climate action. That's quite a difficult question to answer, isn't it? But there you go.
This is the police question, Bevan.
Yeah.
Global police.
It's really interesting. So that particular example is, and with groups like that, they always have very benign names, which are meant to kind of fox you a little bit and make you think that they're doing something fairly positive. So I think Chip might have a point there in terms of actually there's a bit of they are misleading people a little bit, and very often the comments are that, oh yeah, we totally think climate change is a thing, we just don't think our government should be doing anything about it. You know, it's very much like, you know, that type of language. In terms of prosecuting people, it might seem fanciful to people and probably not something that will happen under this government, but I think there is an increasing litigation risk, which people like Net Zero Watch and which companies who are saying other things than what they're doing, and one of them, you know, for example, Shell, you know, lost a court case around his efforts around net zero. Litigation is an increasing risk, organizational and business risk, which companies and businesses and individuals like those politicians are increasingly unaware of as a risk. Especially in this phase where lots of people think they can just say anything, regardless of whether it offends anyone, and we have this argument about free speech and freedom of speech and freedom of opinion. Increasingly, people like that and organisations will get caught out because of litigation, because they will not have presented themselves in a kind of truthful way, or they will have done something which breaks the law. Because they are expressing some kind of opinion, or they're expressing some kind of unfounded opinion or fact, which they think validates their argument. So it's not a fanciful question, and I do think litigation risk is one of those which is going to be increasingly. You're going to hear much more about it in the coming years when it comes to people like Net Zero Watch and other organisations of their ilk. So.
Thanks, Bevan. Well, we're getting very near the close. Is there one last question, a quick one that we can pick up on, Hugh?
Well, there's a big question really in terms of about protocols around the COP process. The question they asked that clearly different countries have different capacities, and so are there protocols around and panels of people around to develop those protocols to show what contributions individual states should make, and and what's the role of the scientific community in that? That's a huge question, but how do we show, I guess, how do we show equanimity and equality of contribution amongst nation states of the COP process? Are there protocols?
Anna, can I ask you to very briefly respond to that big question?
It's a bit like the meaning of life, isn't it, really?
Thank you.
Yes, it's a challenging question, definitely. But supposedly, I mean, these platforms should be equally accessible for all countries, South, North, or whatever we want to define it, developed countries. The truth is that, unfortunately, COP26 was one of the most exclusive COPs in this context. Due to the pandemic, there were different kind of measures established to control precisely the amount of people in the negotiation rooms. And there are delegations per se that they are not as big as many others. I mean, in numbers, for example, there are delegations that probably is just 5 to 10 people, and others that there can be 100 persons in that delegation, and they can cover many different areas. Unfortunately, due to this lack of number of participants, there were countries that were not represented in important decision making about different topics: adaptation, mitigation, finance, loss and damage, different strands of work. So sadly, the countries that were not represented lost quite a lot of their voices being presented in the documents that were at the end the final Glasgow Agreement. If I may present my experience as Mexico, we didn't have a big delegation. Due to these restrictions, for example, we lost a very important piece of work that is human rights. That was completely erased in one of the most important papers of work that was on the Action for Climate Empowerment. So sadly, it happens. Yes, sadly, it's a process that can happen. And the UNFCCC is really aware that this should be an inclusive process for everyone and for everybody to be represented as members of the convention.
Thank you, Anna. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this webinar. Can I thank Anna, Bevan and Anna for their insight contribution? Went well over the brief that I tempted you in on. So thank you very much for that. It's been a real insight into some areas I wasn't aware of, certainly. So thank you to everybody that's online at the moment. I can see some friends here and some new names. So thank you all for coming to this webinar tonight. Keep a lookout for future webinars. I'm sure if you signed up to Eventbrite, you'll pick them up. So thank you all, and good night, everybody, and a safe night. Bye.